By spring, Bavona remembers how to echo. Waterfalls rehearse their summer roar. Granite wakes from winter like an animal that stretches. On 21st April 2016, Alpensky Regional Flight AS245, a Dornier 328-110 with 32 souls, left Zurich for Lugano under a forecast that promised mountain showers, nothing else. In the left seat, Captain Lucas Frey, a Bernese with the gentle stubbornness of people who have repaired more bicycles than they've broken. In the right, First Officer Leila Bader, 29, Tissanese, a glider pilot who liked the Alps for the same reason climbers do. They tell the truth about wind. They briefed as usual for LSCA, steep approach, winds that grow shoulders as evening drops into the lake. Anti-ice green, radar painting a peppering of returns over the Maggia Valley, nothing mean. Cabin. Senior flight attendant Chiara Valli did what good crew do before anyone knows they need it. Counted babies, watched wrists for medical bracelets, laced her tone with ordinary. 20 minutes after top of descent, as they arced south of the Gotthard, the air turned into a room full of murmurs. A build-up that hadn't been there 15 minutes earlier punched through the radar with a speckled core. Rime ice dusted the leading edges like salt on a black table. Lucas clicked boots and prop heat on, listened for the thump that says a system is awake. Then the airplane flinched. Torque on the left dipped, spiked, dipped again. ITT flickered into a number Leila disliked. An amber bleed annunciation lit for a heartbeat, extinguished, returned. The ECU tried to mother the engine back into line. The cloud decided that motherhood was not on the menu. When the left Pratt & Whitney spooled down past a number that makes a pilot's hands move without asking permission, Leila's fingers were already on the checklist she hoped not to need today. Left engine rollback, she said. Memory items. Lucas, I have control. Pitch and power found a new geometry, one prop aiming to be enough for two. Cabin pressure blipped, not a danger, a reminder that air is a deal you have to keep making. The right engine took the hint, which is to say the wrong lesson. Prop vibrations climbed like a bad thought. For a second, it looked like it would hold. Then fuel flow jittered, as if a drummer had lost the beat. The ECAM, little, Dornier old, honest, stacked messages like a nervous clerk. We're losing the right. Leila hated the sentence, loved that she could say it without drama. Lucas did the thing that separates stories with graves from stories with coffee. He put the nose where the airplane lives when engines don't. Best glide is not a number, it's a pact. Below, granite and pine, and a river that had been carving its opinion for 1,000 years. Asphalt, however, nowhere. Bavona is a string of stone villages that look medieval because they refuse to apologize for stone. Foroglio, Sonlerto, Bavona, names that live in mouths like small prayers. From 9,000 feet, the only straight lines are hydro roads and a maintenance meadow near a power intake where water disappears into concrete like a magic trick. We won't make Lugano, Lucas said it the way surgeons tell truth, without apology. Options. Leila had 3 drawn-in clear lines in her head. Option 1, riverbed, boulders like teeth. 2, meadow near intake, short, soft, downhill. 3, old logging cableway clearing above Foroglio, flat enough with a tailwind from the fall. She didn't like any. She liked choosing. Meadow, Lucas said, down valley, full flaps late, gear up. We land to live, not to roll. He called a mayday that a controller in Locarno would replay at night. Voice level, vowels specifying a valley, most of their maps wrote small. The radio acknowledged with the mercy of a human who knows he cannot magic asphalt into existence. AS245 copy Mayday. Helicopters scrambled. Say intentions. Forced landing. Meadow near Bavona intake, Lucas said. He didn't say pray, because procedures do not pray. They stack. Chiara walked the aisle with a face that told people the cabin was a living room and the thunder outside was an old family argument. Shoes off, seatbelts tight, brace on my command. Babies with me, no bags. We are trained for this. A man reached for his briefcase. She put a hand on his wrist and gave him a better job. Count with me. 1, 2, 3. Rhythm is a kind of anesthesia. The meadow appeared like a single page saved from a book the glaciers mostly burned. Lucas set a profile shallow enough not to dig, firm enough not to float. Layla wound the flaps, watched speed slide to the side of the number that whispers hold. Gear stayed up, wheels on grass at that angle are how airplanes start cartwheeling in reports. They came in like a hand skimming water for temperature. At the flare, a gust tried to turn them giggly. Lucas put the joke away with rudder. Grass said hello like a cat with claws. The first seconds were a hum of knot breaking. Then a bark. The nose gear door met a stone. Then quiet, then people. The new sound being human lungs remembering they have contracts. Fuel, shut. Batteries, keep for radios. Layla's voice had the metronome inside. The airplane tilted slightly as the meadow revealed its tilt. Kiara popped the forward door. Air smelled of moss and aviation, and a kind of fear that isn't panic. It's mathematics. Across the river, the bell in Foroglio told a time that pleased no clock. A farmer with a face like a cliff pulled a Neva around with a rope reel and a crate of thermal blankets. A woman in an apron that had known butter more than kerosene grabbed a first aid kit from a cafe and yelled to a boy to run to the power station. When mountain hears metal, it moves. They tell you emergencies are noise. Sometimes they are order written in chalk across a landscape. Within 5 minutes, the meadow had lanes, and the lanes had jobs. The first job was don't let the airplane slide. The meadow pitched toward a ditch that fed the intake. 2 men in work orange from the hydro station, Marco and Enea, names you can shout, arrived with wheel chocks that had never met wheels like these, and wooden wedges that had. Lucas and Layla stayed on headsets long enough to confirm the rotors from Rega would catch their scent. Then they dropped cables and became hands. Don't stand downhill, Marco said, not because he needed to be boss, but because gravity is. The villagers threw rocks against the downhill gear doors and stakes around the props. Enea hammered iron spikes through tire straps, anchored them to spruce roots that had been gripping that mountain since before the first Dornier flew. A 16-year-old with rope from a Via Ferrata kit laced the nose to a rock like a climber tying in. Redundant, clean, check. Kiara built a triage without asking anyone's permission. Babies and elders here. Anyone dizzy, sit and count my fingers. Anyone bleeding, raise your hand. If no hand, say here. 2 nurses on holiday materialized like the Alps had anticipated them and sent them there on purpose. They split the cabin into green, yellow, red with scarves and a disciplinary smile. A teenager with a skateboard offered his board. It became a spine board because nouns are democratic under stress. The second job was make a bridge. Between meadow and service road, a ditch deeper than a man, colder than a statistic. The hydro station had planks. The villagers had backs. A man everyone called Nonno by habit he had earned supervised the fulcrum like a conductor who knows where the flutes hide. When the first plank sagged, he grunted, and a thicker one replaced it without debate. Load spreaders under the wheel path were just fence rails renamed, married to flat stones arranged by people whose grandparents called this rock by first names. A woman named Rosa commandeered the cafe kitchen. Tea and broth and sugar became tools. Sugar now, tears later, she said to a passenger who was shivering from adrenaline debt. A schoolteacher named Elio turned his classroom voice on a cluster of cameras sprouting like nettles. After, film after. Today you carry blankets, not views. Even the boldest stood down. Some days, shame is logistics. We will move them in 4s, Kiara said. 2 on either side, 1 at the head if dizziness, 1 at the feet if panic. Count 1, 2, 3. The valley that echoes listened and returned the count with a bounce so perfect you could keep cadence by it. Lucas unstrapped a woman whose ankle had become a balloon. He did not tell her about his own hands shaking. Layla swapped her headset for a headlamp someone pressed into her hand. I'm not a doctor, she told the nurse. I can carry. "You can lead," the nurse corrected, and put her at the head of a human chain. A farmer rolled up in a tractor with a pallet lashed on, improvised stretcher high enough to dodge brush, low enough not to dump anyone. Behind him, 2 Spitfire-age cable drums became reels for rope to belay the wobblier. The boy who'd run to the power station returned with headsets the engineers used to shout over turbines. Now they were for a different hum. The third job was talk properly. The meadow had language, Italian curses, German imperatives, vowels so French you could lean on them. The Locarno controller asked for the GPS pin of a rescue heli pickup. Layla read it off the Dornier's FMS, now a desk with a window. "Mark the GPS for the clearing above Foroglio too," called Enea. "If they can't hover here, that's your LZ." Rega's pilot came up on the valley frequency with the soft math of someone who has made a career from winter. "I have you on flare of waterfall. I'll test hover, then we decide." The first helicopter broke the sky with a noise that makes prayer redundant. Its downwash nearly took the plank bridge into the ditch until Nono slapped the nearest youth on the shoulder and barked a word with vowels that meant hold. They held. The pilot decided the meadow was too dirty for the first lift. Spray, loose brush, wires that hikers string without telling maps. "Foroglio clearing," Layla said into the mic, already moving toward the path that would have her climbing while still wearing a flight deck lanyard. The path was steep enough to make you feel like a letter tipped off the page. The waterfall spoke in a voice that drowned out everything except hands. The villagers built switchbacks with logs, handrails with branches that still remembered leaves. "Hips to rock, weight on outside foot," Elio instructed, because good advice is the twin of courage. At the clearing, the LZ was a pasture where goats had negotiated their peace with gravity. Rega flared again, kissed a stand of alder, adjusted, then settled, patient as nurses. They moved people the way you move snow, evenly, continuously, without creating avalanches. A man insisted he could walk. Chiara asked him what date it was. He said 2013 with the sincerity of a man who had just left 2016 at the last tree. She put him yellow and sent him anyway. A boy hid his hands because they were torn from carrying planks. Rosa took them in her kitchen and repaired them with butter and a lie about cream. By dusk, Rega had flown 3 rotations. A cantonal rescue team arrived in reflective tape and authority and found their work partly done. Not stolen. Done in the only 15 minutes that mattered. They nodded to Lucas with the mutual respect of wolves who smelled the same winter. An official asked who was in charge. The valley looked at each other and shrugged. The answer was embarrassing because it was true. Everyone. "Keep the story small," a man in a windbreaker said to no one in particular as the last patient lifted. "Less paper, fewer questions." The sentence landed like gravel. Layla heard it and stored it in the part of her mind labeled later. No one had time to argue with a windbreaker. They left the airplane sitting like a metal pilgrim in a field that had not asked for it. The stars began to discover themselves. A cheesemaker who knew weather by the taste of air said there would be frost by morning. "Bring blankets," Rosa ordered, as if commanding a kitchen war. "And shut the cameras off. If you must film, film your hands. Night is when noise has to apply for permits." The meadow accepted it under conditions. Walk soft, speak for purpose. Don't give fear more verbs than it already has. The villagers set up lanterns like constellations, learned their manners. A diesel heater from the hydro station coughed itself awake and made a square of warm, where people were undressed into dry sweaters, and the kind of dignity emergencies try to rob first. Chiara built a roster from voices. Who can stay? Who can lift? Who can watch? Layla's phone, long returned to service, buzzed with messages from operations that said, "We are with you, and don't talk to press, and Rega billing will be handled, and, beneath the politeness, keep it quiet." She put the phone face down. Lucas walked the perimeter with Enea checking ropes like bedtime for a tent nobody planned for. Somewhere between first tea and second silence, Marco told the story of the funicular. The old logging cableway above Foroglio was disused, but not dead. The platform still worked if you knew which lever had rust that meant almost. In the first hour, before anyone stamped an official seal, they had used it to lower a stretcher one notch at a time, while the meadow learned to be an ER. "We did it because it was there," Marco said. "Because legs are not rope, and rope is not miracle." He looked embarrassed. Layla felt a type of anger she kept for later, the kind you reserve for systems that punish the competent. At 22:10, a municipal SUV arrived with men who had laptops and lanyards. They took names in a ledger that already knew what it wanted to say. Passenger count, medical statuses, photographs. Did you see any smoke? Any sparks? Reasonable questions asked in a reasonable tone. Then the addendum. We would appreciate if social media posts were limited. There is a process. There is already enough panic. One of the nurses said softly that panic had not attended that day. Discipline had. The lanyard smiled a type of smile people wear when they are filing it anyway. The fourth helicopter landed after midnight with a federal emblem and a man whose jacket creaked like new. He asked to speak to the captain. Lucas took him to the shadow of the wing. "We'll take it from here," the man said with the voice of a memo. "We'll ask the villagers to go home. We'll do an official statement in the morning." Lucas looked at the meadow, which did not look like it was waiting for permission to have existed. "They are not on my crew," he said. "They are the crew." The man nodded as if this were a nice anecdote. "We can avoid unnecessary liability if we keep the narrative simple. Rega, cantonal, airline cooperation. Thank the communities, of course. No technical details until the office issues a docket." He had the decency to avoid the word cover-up. He had the efficiency to imply it. Later, around a table that had been a spool this morning, Elio the teacher put a notebook down. "I'm making a list," he said to no one in particular. "For when they forget? For when we forget." He started with names he could spell without asking. Chiara, Rosa, Nonno, Marco, Enea, the skateboard, the rope, the plank. Layla added LZ at Foroglio, headlamp trail, gear-up decision, 1 ankle, 2 concussions, 1 near panic, 0 fights. "Put the funicular," Marco said, eyes daring the night. Elio wrote funicular and underscored it twice. A boy of 8 asked Chiara if planes have hearts. "They have centers of gravity, which is how they know where they are." He nodded, satisfied that the world allowed substitutes. Rosa said the kitchen would close at 1, reopen at 4, no exceptions. People obeyed the only curfew that matters in mountain places, the one imposed by fatigue. Toward 2, frost crisped the grass into glitter. Lucas and Layla lay back on a tarp and listened to a silence so clean it made the earlier noise look like a rumor. He confessed, because there is a time for it, that when the prop flickered he saw his daughter's bicycle, pink, tassels, a hill she was not supposed to roll down but did. She confessed that she had wanted to say a prayer but decided to say numbers instead. "All our prayers are numbers," he said, and they laughed a laugh that lands on shoes. At 4, Rosa's kitchen turned back into a body shop for souls. Tea, biscuits, a shot of grappa for the one who pretended he hadn't needed to cry. The hydro engineers ran a checklist that did not exist yesterday. Valves closed, turbine offline, grid notified, meadow secured. They filled out a form called Responsabilità because some words refused translation. At 6, the first official vans appeared with fresh clipboards and a way of standing that says they have both authority and instructions. The windbreaker man from earlier shook Elio's hand like someone exchanging a code in a spy film. "Good work. Now let it go." Elio's face did a thing human faces do when dignity and anger arm wrestle. He said nothing. He would not let it go. He would teach it to a room full of 14-year-olds who believe in maps until the day the map is wrong. They said goodbye in the mountain way. Short, first names, promises not to keep in any legal sense. Lucas hugged Nonno as if hugging granite. "You do not move it. You thank it for not moving you." Layla left her headlamp on Rosa's counter as a tip. Chiara taped a paper to the Dornier's yoke before handing it to the official who would tow the airplane out by memory of roads. We will speak about this properly. And then, like many disasters you survive, daylight made it look almost ordinary. A meadow, some planks, a path where there wasn't one yesterday, a village that still had to bake bread, a river that did not care, and a ledger, the kind without columns, written across the faces of people who had not been planning to be heroes on a Thursday and did it anyway. Dawn arrived like an apology, folded into blue. Frost had stitched the meadow with a thin lace. When you walked, the grass sang a brittle song. The Dornier lay there as if surprised to be a guest, nose upslope, tail politely down toward the ditch, ropes leading from her to spruce roots like veins to a patient. Smoke from Rosa's kitchen drifted across the field and made the whole scene look like a painting, with extra warmth brushed in where people had stood all night. The first vans brought fluorescent vests and polite insistence. The Canton's rescue command set up a formal perimeter, measured distances, unfurled tape. The federal investigators, 2 from FOCA and 1 from the accident board, arrived with clipboards that know the difference between curiosity and procedure. Lucas and Layla gave preliminary statements in a tent whose walls fluttered with the new wind. Chiara moved among volunteers and passengers like an interior minister who knew everyone's first name. "Before we touch anything, we need the recorders," said the senior investigator, a woman with rain in her hair and a voice that made pens behave. Someone had already marked the panel. A mechanic with hands like puzzles extracted the CVR and FDR from their little orange monasteries. They left damp fingerprints of salt on the tablecloth as they were logged. The meadow held its breath in respect for data. Then came the part that governments do well when they're awake: coordination. Rega, cantonal police, hydro company, commune, and the airline's recovery contractor with a truck too civilized for the path. The recovery plan made sense on a whiteboard and less on a slope. The Dornier was to be winched in 2 moves, nose stabilized, tail lifted clear of the ditch, skid across mats toward the service road above the intake. "Your mats will skate," said Marco. "Use the ones that bite." He pointed to bundles of timber that had lived their lives as fence rails. The contractor looked affronted. Then he looked at the ditch, at the frost, at the timber. He swallowed his pride with the elegance of someone who prefers results to reputation. Nono, who did not believe in gentle metaphors for gravity, supervised the anchor points and muttered old words over new ratchets, the way mountain men bless the marriage between steel and slope. While the teams rehearsed their ballet, the first version of the story began to thicken in the air, through official sentences and the marrow of rumor. A gentle press release announced coordinated response by authorities and air rescue services, with thanks to local communities for their cooperation. The word cooperation did not include the funicular, the planks, the rope, the headlamps, the human chain. It was not malice, it was the grammar of institutions: keep sentences smooth so budgets don't panic. Elio, the teacher, watched a cameraman film the tidy part of the meadow and none of the planks with bark. "They'll say it was all clean," he told Layla, who had come to thank him and to borrow for the 100th time the knight's courage. "They'll say Rega and the canton, and they'd be right, but not whole." Layla nodded. She was already keeping a quiet ledger. Who held the nose rope? Who ran the headsets? Who talked the plank bridge into existence? Who said the sentence about less paper? She was not planning a fight. She was planning memory. By mid-morning, the winch sang its slow hymn. The village gathered at a distance that felt like both respect and ownership. The tail skid cleared the ditch in a groan that made shoulders climb toward ears. The mats did skate at first, then bit as the timber and stones learned each other's names. A Rega pilot in a red jacket kept his heli awake above the tree line, rotor turning lazy, insurance against surprise. When the Dornier finally found the road, people clapped the way they clap when a tricky piano passage lands, with relief for work, not for luck. A tall man in a navy windbreaker arrived in a clean SUV. Federal, insurance, airline. He had the fragrance of varnish, recently briefed, here to polish the thing into a story that would travel well on paper. He shook hands. He praised professionalism. He said the right nouns in the right order: crew resource management, interagency coordination, community spirit. Then, almost casually, he asked Rosa whether she would remove the social media post with the funicular lowering. Because, Rosa asked, voice in its apron. Because it creates misunderstandings. The funicular is not safe without inspection. If the insurer sees it was used, they might question liabilities. And some political people will ask why an old cable was moved before professionals arrived. It could complicate compensation. He smiled the smile people use when they think they're doing you a favor. Rosa looked at the waterfall, then at the man, then at the post on her phone. She remembered the stretcher going notch by notch while a man bled slower because they didn't wait. She did not delete it. She did not argue. She put the phone back in her pocket and said, "There is more coffee if your driver wants it." Sometimes dissent is a gentle refusal to participate. In the afternoon, a short, careful statement was prepared for the press. Lucas recognized sentences he could have written: forced landing controlled, no fatalities, investigation ongoing. He also recognized absences. "May I add one line?" he asked the investigator. She raised an eyebrow. "What line?" "That local residents built bridges, anchors and trails before the rescue was formally stood up. They did it safely. We owe them more than adjectives." The investigator studied him. Then the windbreaker man, then the meadow. "We can thank communities explicitly," she said, and wrote it down. The windbreaker's jaw registered a small disappointment. He said nothing. On the evening news, the line survived. It was something. A partial truth is a door wedged with a shoe, not open, not shut. That night, when the valley grew its stars again, Elio copied his list to a cleaner notebook. He added timestamps. He added tiny sketches of knots. He felt both petty and holy. Layla passed by Rosa's kitchen for a last tea. "They will make it neat," she said. "We were not neat." Rosa patted the counter, which still had a burn from the first frantic kettle. "Let them be neat," she said. "We will be accurate." 2 days after the landing, a journalist named Matteo Wirth arrived in a hatchback that wore its miles with gratitude. He was Swiss-Italian, shoulders permanently leaning forward like someone listening too hard, a notebook that preferred verbs to adjectives. He had spent a career interviewing people after avalanches and finding the nouns that don't embarrass grief. He asked no permission to be earnest. "Who moved first?" he asked Elio. "Not in the official sequence. In the real one." Elio led him to the ditch, to the planks, to the place where Rope had learned to speak human. He introduced him to Marco and Enea, to Nonno, to the boy who ran to the power station, to the cafe apron with burned fingers named Rosa. He showed him the funicular platform that had been disused in official language and obvious in human one. Matteo filmed with his eyes, not his phone. "Write your names," he asked. People demurred. He insisted politely. "Insurers don't love anonymous heroes," he said. "Anonymous is easy to erase." In Bellinzona, the hydro company's PR emailed the commune, "We should avoid public confusion about the funicular. It is not rated for rescue." In Zurich, an airline manager typed, "Please coordinate messaging" 3 times in 3 different threads. In Bern, a person with a title that began with deputy suggested a thank you event for the valley, with speeches that would say words like community and resilience and avoid liability and jurisdiction. Matteo found Layla and Chiara at the cafe that had become an ops room. He asked for exact verbs. Layla gave them: decided, tied, counted, carried. He asked for the sentence that had kept panic small. Chiara said, "If I say brace, we brace. If I say breathe, we breathe." He wrote that down like a priest. He asked Lucas whether the meadow was the only option. Lucas answered like a surgeon. It was the only good option. The riverbed had rocks like opinions. The clearing had tailwind with a cliff like a joke. Matteo smiled in thanks. It was precisely this clarity, unsentimental, unsloppy, that built trust. Then the ledger grew teeth. Someone leaked to Matteo an internal memo from a regional liaison. Prefer messaging that emphasizes official rescue assets. Minimize reference to pre-arrival civilian actions that may contravene safety protocols. The motive wasn't cartoon villainy, it was insurance, policy, the fear that a precedent might encourage unsafe heroics next time. But the phrase landed in Matteo's notebook like a slug. He called the liaison and asked the most dangerous polite question in Swiss journalism. Can you help me understand the why behind this sentence? The liaison said words like risk, discouraging copycat, protecting communities from liability. Matteo asked whether protecting communities also included protecting their credit when they did things correctly. The liaison said he would check with communications. Matteo did not publish a hit piece. He published the timeline, meticulous, quadruple-sourced with names, of the first 40 minutes, who crossed the ditch with what, who anchored which rope, which nurse took the first vitals, which hand turned which lever on the funicular platform. He added a paragraph that explained that using industrial devices without inspection can be dangerous and is not advised. Then he added that in this case, the platform was operated by the station's own staff with daily familiarity, under the direction of the very people who maintain it. He did not conclude. He exposed the conclusion gently to air. The piece did what good writing does. It changed the denominator. Instead of asking, was there a cover-up? People began to ask, why did the first draft of the story omit the most useful parts? Elio pinned the article to the cafe wall next to a photo of the plank bridge. Rosa printed a copy and slid it under the funicular lever like a talisman. In Bern, a meeting grew tense without raising voices. The windbreaker man said, "We just can't encourage civilians to improvise." The investigator with rain in her hair said, "We didn't encourage, we witnessed. And if we erase them, we learn less next time." The FOCA director, who looked like he had finished his coffee years ago and never started another, said, "Our messaging should not buy insurance with the currency of reality." The sentence stuck to the inside of the room like steam. The airline tried to settle the story into the shape airlines like: brave crew, excellent coordination, gratitude, learning. Lucas asked permission to add something to his internal crew memo. "Don't underestimate the valley. They built us a runway after we landed." The memo went around, underlined in at least one base in every language the company uses. Cabin crew left hearts in the comments next to Chiara's two-sentence brief. That week, a box appeared in Rosa's kitchen. Foil blankets, headlamps, gloves, a laminated card titled "Human Chain, Do's and Don'ts." It was not heroic. It was logistics. Elio organized a Saturday morning meadow drill with the teenagers, the rope boy, the skateboard donor, where they practiced moving a weighted dummy across planks, counting in fours, breathing on cue. 2 Rega medics came on their day off and corrected details, hips to rock, eyes first, feet second. Nono grumbled that drills turn goats into goats that believe they're soldiers, then came anyway, then smiled when nobody was looking. Matteo returned for one more question. "What do you want to keep quiet?" he asked Layla. She surprised herself. "The moment when I wanted to say amen and said numbers instead." He smiled with respect and didn't print it. Not because it wasn't true, but because truth also lives in things entrusted. By Friday, the ledger had grown edges. It had names in ink, dates in digits, knots in diagrams, and a copy of the liaison memo with a coffee ring that made it look more human than it deserved. Elio wrote a title at the top, "We did not wait for permission." He crossed it out. He wrote another, "We waited for no one to suffer." That one stayed. Cover-ups rarely wear capes. They wear templates. You can spot them if you know what to look for. The same 3 safe nouns, the same choreography of gratitude, the same narrowing of story until only the parts that tidy budgets remain visible. What happened in Bavona was smaller than a scandal and bigger than an oversight. A slow attempt to file off the fingerprints of a community rescue to avoid a future in which a lawyer uses yesterday's courage against tomorrow's balance sheet. Matteo found a consultant in Zurich who had written insurance guidance for industrial accidents. Over coffee that tasted expensive and tired, the consultant said, "If civilians use unapproved equipment, insurers can argue contributory negligence. So managers preemptively trim narratives." He said it like weather. Matteo asked whether there was a way to tell the truth and still discourage stupidity. "Yes," the consultant said, "you distinguish between competence and recklessness. You show that the hydro staff operated their own device on their own turf. You praise discipline, not improvisation for its own sake." It sounded almost revolutionary, to use a complete sentence on television. Meanwhile, the airline's regional manager visited the valley with gift baskets that looked like pastries, apologizing for their calories. He thanked everyone. He avoided specifics. He offered to fund a community first aid kit and left forms. Rosa accepted the kit and put the forms under the kettle. "We prefer drills to plaques," she said. FOCA released a preliminary report that was both sober and surgeon-like. Weather evolved. Engine rollback under icing, ingestion, correct forced landing technique. No fatalities, local community assistance. They did not mention the funicular by name. They did not need to for the truth to remain in the shape of the paragraph. The windbreaker man drafted a separate communication for a political superior that underlined the value of swift professional response and minimized pre-arrival actions by laypersons. It read like a letter from a neat world to a messy one. At the hydro company, a safety officer wrote a note that felt like a prayer to practical gods. "Next time, call us on Channel 3. We know which lever squeaks." He taped it to the funicular panel. His boss removed it. Then, 3 days later, an engineer put up a laminated version with the boss's signature. Organizations learn, one stubborn note at a time. Layla and Lucas were invited to a ceremony in Bellinzona where officials would thank the crew and agencies. Layla said she would come if Chiara could speak. The program manager swallowed, then agreed. On stage, Chiara wore her uniform like a syntax that fits. She thanked Rega, the canton, the investigators. Then she thanked non-uniforms by first name, the way you don't in official rooms. Rosa, who boiled courage. Marco and Enea, who hammered gravity into cooperation. Nonno, who argued with the slope until it listened. Elio, who took attendance for truth. The boy with rope, the nurse on holiday, the teacher with the voice that turns mountains into classrooms. The room didn't know whether to clap or take notes. It did both. Afterward, the windbreaker man approached Chiara and said politely, "We'd prefer fewer names, privacy concerns." Chiara smiled with both teeth and patience. "I asked them first," she said. "They prefer to exist." A small storm brewed online. An anonymous account posted, "If the crew and villagers were so competent, why land there at all? Show-off pilots." Underneath, a dozen people who had walked the meadow climbed into the comments with GPS coordinates, slope percentages, photos of boulders the size of cows, and the sentence, "He landed where we could save each other." It is hard to troll a valley that has rehearsed its verbs. In Bern, the FOCA director called a small meeting without the windbreaker man. "We will publish a public learning brief," he said, "with 3 sections, what the crew did, what the agencies did, what the community did. We will specify do and don't for civilians. We will include the funicular as operated by site staff. We will add a line, don't touch it if it isn't yours. Do use it if it is, and you know it by name. And we will remind insurers that reality comes first. If they prefer fiction, they can try to invoice it." The room smiled for the first time in a week. Matteo wrote a second piece. It was not angry. It was useful. It explained the difference between glory and duty. It traced how cover-ups begin with a reasonable fear, lawsuits, and end by erasing exactly the thing that saves lives, competent neighbors. He included a photograph that a Rega medic had taken from the clearing, a human chain shaped like a sentence, subject, verb, object, bridging airplane to goat pasture. The caption read, "Syntax of rescue." At the cafe, a tourist asked to buy Elio's notebook. Elio laughed as if someone had offered to adopt his grandmother. "No," he said, "but you can read it." The tourist did, and then left a donation toward rope and tea. Elio wrote the amount in a margin and drew a small kettle beside it. Accountancy, Valley style. The cover story didn't vanish. It thinned. By the time the recovery truck pulled the Dornier onto a low loader under a sky that had decided to behave, the official narrative had acquired enough local nouns to stand upright. The windbreaker man shook hands again. Rosa poured him coffee again. He looked at her phone again on the counter, at the funicular post that was still there, at the picture of the plank bridge. He said nothing. He took his coffee black. Even varnish learns. That night, Lucas sat by the river and tried to name the motive behind the polite erasure. He found three: fear of liability, fear of encouraging fools, fear of admitting dependence on citizens. He wrote them down and then felt something strange: compassion. Institutions are like aircraft, they hate surprises. He decided his work wasn't to fight them, it was to give them a procedure for telling the whole truth safely. He called the investigator with rain in her hair. "Make us a checklist for public truth," he said. "Step 1, thank everyone by name if they want it. Step 2, distinguish trained staff from civilians clearly. Step 3, publish don't guidance immediately. Step 4, don't buy insurance with reality." She laughed in relief and said, "I'll write the memo. You sign it with me?" He said yes. The checklist would appear a week later as a one-page PDF that traveled faster than any press release. In the valley, the night learned to be ordinary again. Rosa's kitchen closed at 11 and reopened at 4. The funicular lever sat quiet, oiled, not a character in a morality play, but a thing that does a job. The rope boy learned a better knot. The teacher practiced taking calmer attendance of chaos. And somewhere up in Bern, a windbreaker hung on the back of a chair, while its owner wrote a new sentence: "We will tell the whole story next time." Whether he meant it or not mattered less than the fact that now there was an outline. They called it a public hearing, but it felt more like a harvest. Everyone brought what they had grown these weeks: data, memories, splinters of rope with stories still clinging to the strands. The room in Bellinzona was wood and light. The nameplates read Foca, Cantonal Rescue, Rega, Hydro Company, Alpensky, and then a line that made the windbreaker man purse his lips. Val Bavona Community Representatives. 3 chairs for Rosa, Elio, and Marco. A 4th chair empty, labeled Nonno. He said the mountain didn't do microphones. His absence weighed like granite and served as punctuation. The investigator with rain in her hair, .ssa Lenzi, opened without varnish. "We will cover sequence, choices and learning. Nobody is here to audition for villain or saint." Slides came quiet and careful. Radar that afternoon, Rega timelines, the winch plan that had worked only because the timber learned to bite, not skate. She paused where the official summary would normally end and turned to Rosa. "Please explain the funicular," Lenzi said. Rosa did not stand. She wore the apron that had boiled courage and broth. "It's an old logging cableway. The Hydra staff know its levers better than they know their Sunday prayers. We weren't brave," she said, palms flat on the table. "We were specific. The platform lowers sacks and people the way the mountain likes. Slow, tested, watched. We used the thing that belonged to the valley. We did not invent an adventure." Marco added the verbs that do real work: lash, belay, check, count. Inea, who had never planned to speak, took the microphone and used it like a tool. "We chose redundancies like we choose insurance," he said. Rope is cheaper than regret. A Rega medic nodded. The room exhaled. A collective recognition that this wasn't romance. It was method that happens to smell like wood and diesel instead of policy paper. Then came the memo. The liaison's minimize pre-arrival civilian actions sentence, projected big, not to embarrass, but to dissect. Lindsay handled it like a stubborn knot. Fear of liability is real, she said. So is fear of encouraging foolishness, but erasing competent actions by site staff and trained locals lowers learning. Today we propose a framing that respects both. Don't touch it if it isn't yours. Do use it if it is, and you know it by name. The line landed with the thud of a thing you can remember in crisis. Questions flew, polite and pointy. Why didn't the first press releases mention the plank bridge? Could the meadow stabilization have been dangerous? The recovery contractor answered with grace. Without the community's anchors, our mats would have skated into the ditch. Their stakes made our plan possible. The windbreaker man tried to smooth history into brand. We coordinated efficiently, he said. Rega Canton Airline. We were swift, professional. Elio smiled thinly. Yes, he said. And we were here 15 minutes before anyone with a vest could possibly arrive. We would like our 15 minutes to exist in the file. A lawyer asked who would have been responsible if the funicular failed. The hydro safety officer raised his hand. We would, he said, unafraid. Which is why we operated it. Our lever, our maintenance, our weather. And next time, we will call Channel 3 earlier so coordination wears a uniform as well as boots. Even the insurance representative wrote that down. Coordination has channels as well as sentiments. Lindsay unveiled something unusual for such hearings. A one-page public truth checklist, born from Lucas's late-night phone call and refined by people who had already paid tuition in sweat. It read, name everyone who acted, agencies and community, and separate trained staff from civilians without shame. Describe what was done, not just who. Verbs teach better than nouns. Publish, do, don't guidance alongside praise. Don't mythologize improvisation, do codify competence. Explain why some actions were safe here, ownership, familiarity, maintenance, and would be unsafe elsewhere. Never buy insurance with the currency of reality. It wasn't poetry. It was a rope thrown across a decade of future misunderstandings. When it was Lucas's turn, he declined the pedestal. We landed where we could save each other, he said. The valley built a runway after we landed. Please write that sentence down. Layla spoke of GPS pins and block language to ATC that cleared clutter. Kiara spoke of voice, not loud, anchored, and counted to 3 into the microphone as if that too was data. Later in the corridor, the windbreaker man stopped Rosa. About your post, he began. Rosa looked at him like you look at a customer who wants a cappuccino in a kitchen without milk. The post stays, she said, kinder than the week deserved. But we will add the guidance. We will teach the difference, that is the point, no? He nodded, because the only move left was decency. By evening, headlines used the new sentence. The valley's 15 minutes had been admitted into the record, not as confetti, but as procedure dressed in flannel and mud. Mateo filed a follow-up. Syntax of rescue revised, where the subjects and verbs kept their places, and the object was no longer narrative control, but future safety. Change kept its receipts where spreadsheets don't reach. In Bern, budgets shifted with the stiffness of old trees in wind. FOCA earmarked funds for a community interface program, joint exercises that brought Rega medics, canton officers, and village brigades into the same meadow on purpose. The first drill looked absurd. Teenagers in high-vis vests practicing human chains under a sprinkler, while a firefighter critiqued hand placement. It worked. A refrain emerged. Even drills need tea. Rosa's kitchen became the de facto mess hall. Logistics are more obedient when you bribe them with soup. The hydro company did the unglamorous thing that saves lives quietly. posted a laminated operations card at the funicular, lever sequence, max load, wind limits, channel 3 contact, and the sentence, "Do not operate if you have not signed today's inspection line." They painted the platform edge bright, replaced a tired pulley, and added a slow alarm that nagged if someone rushed the descent. "We are not making heroes," the safety officer said to a reporter angling for romance. "We are making habits." Alpensky fought its own dragons in conference rooms. The legal team worried about precedent, the ops team worried about people, finance worried about numbers, and the union worried about respect. They came out with a joint communiqué that managed to be honest and dull, often the most ethical tone. Commitment to include water landing decision-making in coastal routes training, to co-design cabin leadership modules with crew like Chiara, and to set up LZ protocols with Rega for non-airport extractions. A flight attendant on the back row whispered, "Boring at last," as if she had spotted a friend in a crowd. The insurer showed up differently now. Instead of nudging for erasure, they asked what documentation would make next time easier to underwrite. Marco held up Elio's notebook. "This," he said, "names, times, knots, weather. You want to reduce uncertainty? Respect local ledgers." The adjuster, to his credit, asked Elio for a copy. Elio declined with a smile, then offered to teach the adjusters how to read the meadow, the way you read a street you grew up on, where slick hides, where frost is likely by dawn. Schools added a unit called Help Without Becoming a Hazard. Elio took his ledger to classrooms, where kids learned the difference between spectating and serving. How to hold a towel so it doesn't snag, how to use voices as tools. "You, yes you, in the red jacket, hold this rope." How to step back when the thing you don't know will make you dangerous. The unit ended with a field trip to the meadow. "No Instagram," Elio would say. "Today, we install a memory." The press adjusted too. Newsrooms adopted a small-style rule. When covering rescues involving civilians, include a do-don't box vetted by responders. Don't stand in LZ paths. Don't use drones within X meters. Do bring blankets and names to hand over to medics. It didn't always make it to air. It made it into the decision-making of producers, which is where usefulness lives. A grant appeared with less fanfare than a meteor. Funds for valley radios, for headlamps, for a shed by the meadow that held more than grass. On the shed door, someone wrote in paint you'd use on boats. We waited for no one to suffer. It became a place where teenagers loitered responsibly. The political machines learned slowly, then sometimes quickly. The canton drafted a micro-policy on acknowledgement language that forbade the passive erasure of pre-arrival community actions. It didn't invite reckless copycats. It specified conditions, owners operating their equipment, assistance under direction, coordination as early as possible, and a crisp statement that bravery is not a defense if stupidity is the charge. The windbreaker man signed it, either penance or progress. Hard to tell, both useful. There were costs you could not invoice. Layla stopped waking at 03:11. She now woke at 05:40 and made tea with the headlamp Rosa had refused to take back even after many tries. Lucas bought a pack of graph paper and wrote procedures on it in pencil first, as if that made them easier to erase when reality protested. Chiara started keeping 2 boxes for letters. Thanks, to reread on bad days, and proof for herself on days when people called her just cabin. The letters flowed like weather. From a Rega pilot. Your GPS pins were the difference between theater and surgery. From a teenager. I used your counting to help my grandma down the stairs when she fell. 3 is a magic number. From the insurer. Yes, the insurer. Your documentation improved our loss modeling. That sentence belongs to a new world. Matteo wrote the piece he had promised himself he would if the valley kept its nerve. It was not about scandal. It was about the economics of candor, how telling the whole truth makes next time cheaper, not in money alone, but in time to action, clarity, and the moral oxygen that keeps competence awake. He closed with a line that sounded like Rosa but was mathematically solid. "We cannot invoice the tea that kept hands steady. We can memorialize it." Lucas started saying yes to recurrent days he had previously avoided. He sat in the back of classrooms, where young pilots learned to inherit skies, and he waited for the moment when someone would chase a needle in a weather sim. "What is your quiet truth?" he'd ask, and when a cadet answered, "Ground first, air later," he would redirect them to the meadow. "Sometimes the ground isn't ready," he would say. "Sometimes you have to make it ready, with people, with verbs." On his kitchen wall, he pinned the public truth checklist with a magnet shaped like a cow. Seriousness and cow humor can share a room. Layla grew into her own voice. She taught a module she called Maps That Don't, a class on reading landscapes that aren't airports. She used photos of the Bavona Valley taken by Elio's students, arrows in chalk, distances in feet and heartbeats. She coined a line that pilots stole shamelessly. "A good diversion is a pre-written paragraph, not an improvisation." At home, she kept the headlamp by the kettle and sometimes, just sometimes, wore it while making tea. A private joke with fear. On bad nights, she counted backwards from 3, a trick she learned from Kiara's cadence. Kiara became an unlikely curriculum designer. Her 2-sentence brief, "If I say brace, we brace. If I say breathe, we breathe," went into company training exactly as spoken, not scrubbed of humanity. She added a 3-person chain lab to crew recurrent, not macho, not performative, method. She learned to say no to talk shows that wanted tears and said yes to a nursing school that wanted her to teach voice. She kept making tea for strangers and taped to the galley cabinet a copy of the thanks letter from the baby's mother. "Tell them you taught us to breathe." On days when a passenger tried to take a bag to the slide, she'd say, "Look at me," and watch the bag release like a bad idea. The valley itself earned a place in the nation's folklore, not as a postcard, but as a lab. The shed by the meadow became a museum so tiny it refused the word. It held a rope, a plank with a notch worn into it by the day, a headset that still smelled like turbine room, a copy of Elio's ledger under glass, with one page deliberately blurred, not for secrets, for privacy. Kids touched the rope and learned about load. Tourists read the line, "We waited for no one to suffer," and put their phones away for a minute they could not record. Nono never visited. He said the mountain already remembered. The portraits included others. Mateo became a verb in some newsrooms. "Can you Mateo this piece?" Meaning, can you swap heat for light? The windbreaker man stopped wearing that jacket to valley meetings. He brought a sweater instead, and once, on a day surprise rain cracked open, he held a tarp over the ledger table. He didn't post about it. We count that as progress. Not every echo was warm. A podcast tried to tell the story as conspiracy achieved. Shadowy officials, suppressed footage, a noble village against a machine. Clicks loved it, usefulness didn't. Rosa let it pass like a cold wind and kept serving soup in drills. She had adopted a phrase from Kieran, no, wrong story, from a Zurich consultant who had become a friend. Praise discipline, not improvisation for its own sake. The valley's pride was not in doing crazy things, it was in doing normal things at the right time. The portraits ended in a kitchen because many truths do. Rosa spread cheese and cut bread, while Layla and Lucas argued amiably about whether the first call should always be pan-pan, not mayday, for forced landings with control. Kiara drew diagrams of aisle micro-leadership on a paper napkin. Elio twirled a pen and listened. When conversation lulled, Nonno's chair sat empty and approved. The final report landed on a Tuesday with no drama. It rewarded those who prefer nouns to metaphors. Engine power loss consistent with icing ingestion and turbulence, forced landing executed per training, post-landing community actions that reduced exposure to hypothermia and injury, early ATC minimalism that maintained clarity, recovery operations that benefited from local stabilization. It did a brave thing in policy speak. It named the funicular as site staff-operated equipment used within its designed throughput and under experienced control. No romance, just context. The report also printed the public truth checklist in an appendix, as if it were a checklist you could run in the cockpit. It wasn't a stunt, it was bureaucratic judo. Make truth-telling procedural. In a separate section, the report explained why the first draft of the story will always be blurry, because it is written under sirens, and why revision must not become erasure. It sanctioned do-don't boxes for civilian involvement and formalized Channel 3 as the right first ring to pull. There was a ceremony without a plaque. Rega pilots and Valley hands stood in a line that wasn't straight, but was sincere. Someone read Elio's sentence, "We waited for no one to suffer," in Italian, German, and French. Someone else, Chiara, counted 1, 2, 3 in the microphone, and for a heartbeat the room obeyed, shoulders lowering in a synchronized exhale. The windbreaker man carried chairs. Rosa dished soup. A minister said 5 sentences, 3 of which mattered. "We will not write them here, we will hold them accountable later." In Zurich, an insurance analyst checked a box that will save minutes next time. Pre-arrival community actions with site-owned equipment, accepted when trained and documented. It moved premium by a number that gave a manager indigestion and gave a valley relief. In Bellinzona, a teacher watched his students practice a human chain across a gym floor, not as theater, but as arithmetic you can do with your hands. In Locarno, a controller added a sticky note to his console. When they say unreliable, give them runway in the sky, fewer words, bigger boxes. Lucas took the train up valley once more, alone. He stood by the meadow and said thank you to nothing in particular and everything in general. Layla wrote the last line in her headlamp's little manual. She had started one, of course she had. Use only when fear asks for extra light. Chiara retired the megaphone battery to keep it from dying quietly in a drawer. Elio closed the ledger and began another. Learning, like rivers, needs fresh pages. Online, the story faded as stories do. In the valley, it remained in texture. A rope in a shed, a painted line, a laminated card, a sentence on a door. Voga archived the docket with a label that read, "Hidden Rescue no longer." It is difficult to say goodbye to a drama that made you kinder. The trick is to let go of the theater and keep the method. The valley did. Sometimes you fly because engines turn fuel into forward. Sometimes because community turns fear into sequence. If the latter sounds less glamorous, good. Glamour is heavy. Method floats.